In a crowded Manhattan diner on a rainy afternoon, a billionaire woman in a diamond-studded coat decided to remind the world who she was. Her voice cut through the hum of chatter as she snapped at a young waitress for bringing the wrong coffee. She wanted an audience, and she got one. Every eye turned as the waitress stood frozen, her hands trembling just slightly. But instead of apologizing, she lifted her gaze, calm and steady, and said a single line that changed the entire room. The clatter of plates stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the woman's smug smile faltered. No one expected a waitress to carry that kind of quiet power. What she said next would expose the loneliness behind all her wealth. The diner held its breath as silence took over like a living thing, crawling into every corner of the small tiled room. The clinking of utensils faded, and even the hum of the coffee machine seemed to hesitate. Victoria Lang, the billionaire whose name adorned magazines and charity plaques, stood frozen mid-gesture, her diamond bracelet throwing fractured light across the counter. Her manicured hand trembled slightly, though she would never admit it. Across from her stood Emily Carter, a young waitress with tired eyes and steady hands, the faint scent of coffee and detergent clinging to her uniform. Her voice had been soft, calm, yet it carried a weight that seemed to press against the walls. The simple words she had spoken still echoed faintly in the air, too measured to be impulsive, too grounded to be emotional. Something inside the room had shifted. The usual chatter of plates and conversations about commutes and weather had vanished, replaced by the electric stillness that follows a lightning strike. Victoria's face was a mask of disbelief, caught somewhere between outrage and confusion. She was a woman accustomed to control, to snapping her fingers and watching the world rearrange itself to her liking. But here, in this modest diner with its flickering neon sign and smell of burnt toast, her authority had found an unexpected opponent. Emily did not flinch, did not retreat. Her stillness itself became an act of quiet rebellion. She simply stood there, her chin lifted, eyes steady, waiting for the storm that would follow. The manager, watching from behind the counter, froze as well, his instincts torn between intervening and staying invisible. The customers, drawn by morbid curiosity and the strange beauty of watching power falter, stayed silent. A man in a grey suit paused mid-bite, a fork hovering before his open mouth. A young woman by the window whispered something to her friend, but her voice never reached completion. Even the radio seemed to lose its signal. The tension thickened like fog. Victoria's reflection shimmered in the glass of the napkin holder. It was the first time she had ever seen herself not as the flawless image on magazine covers, but as something human and uncertain. Her throat felt dry. She had humiliated countless people before, using her voice like a whip to remind them of her rank, her money, her untouchable position. Yet none of them had looked back at her the way Emily did now, with eyes that did not plead or cower but saw right through her. That gaze unsettled her more than any insult could. It was the look of someone who had nothing left to lose and therefore could not be broken. The fluorescent light flickered, casting a cold shimmer across the counter. Somewhere, a spoon rolled off a saucer, the sound sharp as a crack in glass. Victoria's lips parted, but no sound came. The power she had wielded so easily moments ago had dissolved into air. Emily took a slow breath, her composure unbroken, and in that breath, every person in the diner understood something unspoken. Power was not volume, it was control. And in that moment, the billionaire had none. Victoria's face shifted from shock to disbelief as she struggled to process what had just happened. Her voice, once a tool of command, faltered before finding its sharp edge again. She demanded to know what Emily meant, her words dripping with incredulity. The diner's silence made her tone sound even harsher, each syllable cutting through the air like glass. Emily did not retreat. Her expression remained steady, her breathing calm, her hands still resting lightly on the coffee pot she had been holding. Her reply came softly, but the weight behind it landed like a quiet thunderclap. She said that some people mistake cruelty for strength, and that kindness often demands far more courage than power ever could. The words sank into the space between them, unsettling in their simplicity. Victoria blinked, unaccustomed to being confronted without apology or fear. Her entire life had been built on dominance and display, a performance of superiority that never allowed room for reflection. Now, standing before a waitress who spoke with the composure of someone unshaken by wealth, she felt something foreign stirring beneath her anger. The other patrons watched silently, their faces mirrors of restrained awe. The diner's atmosphere, once ordinary and dull, now felt sacred, as if everyone inside was witnessing a reckoning far greater than a spilled cup of coffee or a rude exchange. Emily's tone carried no resentment, no need to humiliate in return. Instead, it carried conviction, the kind that comes from surviving long days, long nights, and the quiet knowledge of one's own worth. Victoria felt her pulse quicken, an unfamiliar tightness forming in her chest. She tried to respond, to reassert control, but her words stumbled out hollow. For the first time, she saw herself not as the center of every room, but as part of a scene she could not dominate. The waitress, this woman she had thought beneath her, had spoken truth without raising her voice, and it unsettled her more than any public scandal could. The room remained suspended in that fragile silence, the sound of rain tapping faintly on the window like a distant metronome. The fluorescent light glinted off Victoria's jewelry, now gaudy instead of glamorous, and the faint reflection of her own face in the chrome napkin holder looked almost unfamiliar. Emily stepped back, her calm presence disarming, her restraint transforming what could have been an argument into a lesson. Her eyes carried quiet empathy, the kind that can soften even pride. Around them, the diner's patrons exhaled softly, still unsure if they were witnessing rebellion or redemption. Victoria could not name what she felt. It was anger mixed with shame, confusion tangled with curiosity. For a fleeting moment, she wanted to ask the waitress how she had learned to be so composed, but she did not. Instead, she looked away, jaw tight, trying to conceal the small fracture spreading through her confidence. And though no one spoke, everyone sensed that something irreversible had begun. The diner manager, a man in his 40s with thinning hair and the kind of weary politeness that comes from years of smoothing over other people's tempers, rushed to the table with his hands raised slightly, his expression a mixture of panic and forced cheer. His name was Carl, and he had worked in that diner long enough to know that one wrong word could ruin a career, a day, or a fragile peace. He apologized profusely to Victoria, stumbling over his words as he promised that the meal would be on the house, that the staff would be retrained, that this kind of disrespect would never happen again. His voice wavered, eager to please, desperate to extinguish the spark before it became a fire. Victoria barely acknowledged him. Her eyes stayed fixed on Emily, searching for some sign of regret, some tremor of apology that would restore the natural order she understood. But Emily's gaze remained steady, her posture calm, her hands loosely clasped in front of her apron. The silence between them stretched thin but unbroken. The soft hum of a ceiling fan filled the void, and the smell of coffee and rain mingled in the air, grounding the scene in ordinary reality that felt suddenly extraordinary. Carl turned to Emily, his voice tight with authority born from fear rather than conviction, telling her to apologize immediately. The word sounded hollow, almost meaningless. Emily nodded slightly, not to submit but to show respect for his position. Her tone was gentle when she spoke, saying that she was sorry for upsetting anyone but that she had spoken only the truth. The statement was not defiance, yet it carried an undeniable finality. A few customers shifted uneasily in their seats, glancing from the billionaire to the waitress as though watching two worlds collide. Victoria's expression tightened, her pride wrestling with something raw and uncomfortable. For the first time in years, she had no script for what to say next. The manager, sweating under the fluorescent lights, gestured awkwardly for Emily to step aside, but the moment had already passed. The confrontation had ended not with shouting or drama, but with a quiet dignity that left an imprint deeper than any raised voice could. Victoria felt her own composure falter, the mask she had built through decades of boardroom battles slipping in front of strangers who now looked at her differently. The authority that once made rooms bend around her now hung useless in the air. She brushed invisible crumbs from her sleeve, a small motion meant to reassert control, but her trembling fingers betrayed her. The diner felt smaller, the walls closer, the air thick. Carl stood silently, defeated, realizing that no amount of customer service training could fix what had just been revealed. Emily stepped back toward the counter, her movement steady, her expression unreadable. The tension lingered like perfume after someone leaves the room. Victoria finally exhaled, a shallow, unsteady sound. The crowd pretended to return to their meals, but every heart in that diner beat faster, aware they had just witnessed something rare: arrogance, meeting grace, and finding itself unprepared for the impact. Emily returned to her station behind the counter, her steps light but deliberate, the soft squeak of her shoes blending with the low hum of the diner's flickering lights. Her face was calm, though her pulse thudded with the aftershock of what had just happened. She refilled a cup of coffee for an older man at the end of the counter, thanked him softly, and resumed her rhythm as though nothing had occurred. Yet everyone in the room felt the residue of that confrontation clinging to the air. Conversations restarted in hesitant fragments, whispered between bites and sips, but none of them could escape the gravity of what they had just witnessed. A woman in a red coat leaned toward her husband, her voice barely above a breath, marveling at the waitress's composure. The young man near the door adjusted his phone on the table, pretending to scroll but secretly recording, his lens angled just enough to capture the billionaire's stunned expression. Outside, rain streaked the windows, turning the neon reflection of the diner's sign into a hazy, surreal glow. Victoria Lang still sat frozen in her booth, the edges of her confidence crumbling in the face of an unfamiliar emotion she refused to name. Her mind replayed Emily's words again and again, the tone so controlled yet impossibly piercing. It was as if the waitress had not just spoken to her, but through her, cutting past the surface and reaching the hollow beneath. She wanted to lash out again, to say something that would erase the humiliation, but the weight of the eyes around her kept her still. Every diner patron now knew her name, and worse, they knew her weakness. Emily caught her gaze for the briefest moment and offered a nod, not of apology, but of quiet closure, as if granting permission for the moment to end. The young man's phone captured it all, an unnoticed spark that would later ignite a wildfire of public fascination. The clatter of dishes resumed, but the usual noise had changed texture, carrying a strange reverence. It was the sound of witnesses returning to ordinary life while knowing they had seen something that transcended it. Emily's hands moved with practiced precision, yet her mind fluttered with an odd mix of fear and freedom. She had spoken without calculation, and though she knew it might cost her job, she felt lighter, anchored by something deeper than employment or consequence. At the far end of the diner, Victoria gathered her purse with mechanical care, the metallic click of its clasp echoing louder than it should. She rose without a word, her eyes avoiding everyone, and moved toward the door. The bell chimed faintly as it closed behind her, swallowed by the rain outside. Inside, the silence she left behind was not empty but charged, filled with the unspoken acknowledgement that the exchange had meant something. A young waitress had just rewritten the rules of power with nothing but calm conviction. Outside, the city felt colder than it had an hour before as Victoria Lang stepped into the rain, her umbrella snapping open against the wind with an unsteady hand. The limousine waited at the curb, its sleek, black frame gleaming under the streetlights, the kind of vehicle meant to insulate her from the world. Yet, as she sank into the leather seat, the usual comfort of its silence felt suffocating. The driver, a quiet man named Harris who had worked for her for years, caught her expression in the rearview mirror and wisely said nothing. She stared out the window, watching raindrops slide down the glass, blurring the city lights into streaks of color. Her reflection appeared ghost-like against the backdrop of passing cars, and for the first time she did not recognize herself. The sharpness in her eyes had dulled, replaced by something uncertain. The image of Emily Carter standing firm beneath the diner's buzzing lights replayed in her mind on an endless loop. The calm defiance in that young woman's voice had pierced through her like a note struck on an old piano, haunting and precise. Victoria clenched her jaw, telling herself it meant nothing, that the girl was insolent, that she had simply been embarrassed in public. But the harder she tried to dismiss it, the louder the memory echoed. She thought of the people who worked for her, the assistants who flinched at her tone, the board members who nodded too quickly at her words, the waitstaff who smiled with hollow politeness during her endless charity dinners. She had mistaken their fear for respect and their silence for admiration. A small ache formed in her chest, sharp and unfamiliar. The limousine stopped at a red light, and a homeless man crossed in front of the car pushing a cart draped in plastic bags. The sight irritated her for a heartbeat, then unsettled her for reasons she couldn't name. The rain made everything glisten, even the broken, even the forgotten. She pressed a hand against her temple, trying to steady the pulse beating there. Harris glanced back once more, but she waved him off, unwilling to meet his eyes. The city around her roared with life, but inside the car was only the sound of her uneven breathing. She arrived at her building, a towering monument of glass and steel overlooking the river, and stepped out without waiting for her umbrella. The rain soaked her hair and dripped down her face as she walked through the marble lobby. The concierge greeted her, but she barely nodded. When the elevator doors closed, she caught her reflection again, pale and streaked with water. For years, she had prided herself on never being shaken, on always having the last word. Now, she could not shake the quiet conviction of a waitress who had refused to bow. In the echo of that voice, Victoria Lang felt something fragile, fracture within her. The first tremor of a soul forced to see itself clearly. In her penthouse high above the sleepless city, Victoria Lang poured herself a glass of red wine, though her hands trembled enough to leave small splashes on the marble counter. The vast room stretched around her in silence, the kind of silence that once soothed her but now felt suffocating. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the glittering sprawl of New York beneath a veil of rain, the city pulsing with life while she stood alone among her curated perfection. Every object gleamed, every surface polished, every detail meticulously arranged, yet the space felt hollow. She sat on the edge of the white leather sofa, her posture immaculate, her expression vacant. The memory of the diner replayed in her mind with cruel clarity, each second sharper than the last. Emily's voice still echoed in her thoughts, soft but immovable. The words had stripped away the armor she had worn for decades, the one built from money, power, and the illusion of control. She tried to drown them out with another sip of wine, but the taste was bitter, metallic. Her reflection in the window stared back at her, distorted by raindrops, and for a fleeting moment she saw herself not as Victoria Lang, the billionaire philanthropist, but as a frightened woman cornered by her own success. She had spent years crafting an image of invincibility, collecting admiration like currency, but one calm sentence from a waitress had undone it all. Anger flickered in her chest, but behind it was something worse, something that felt suspiciously like shame. She told herself it was absurd to care about the opinion of a stranger, yet the thought refused to fade. She rose and paced the room, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. The sound seemed too loud, too deliberate, a reminder of how she filled silence with motion, so she would not have to feel stillness. She stopped by a framed photograph on the wall, one taken years ago at a charity event where she stood smiling beside city officials and business partners. Her smile was perfect, her eyes cold. She could not remember the cause that night had supported. The emptiness behind that realization hit her like a small, cruel truth. She set the wine glass down and stared out the window again, her eyes following the winding streets below. Somewhere down there was the diner, its flickering sign probably still glowing through the rain, filled with people who would soon forget her name, but never forget the moment they had witnessed. The thought made her chest tighten. She whispered something to herself under her breath, a question rather than an answer. Why did those words matter so much? The city offered no reply, only the steady rhythm of rain against glass. The loneliness she had cultivated in exchange for power now pressed against her from every direction, and for the first time she wondered if all her success had been built not on strength, but on fear. The next morning arrived grey and heavy, the rain lingering as mist against the glass of Victoria's penthouse windows. She sat at her breakfast table, untouched coffee cooling beside a plate of fruit arranged by her housekeeper hours earlier. Her phone vibrated across the marble surface, and the name of her publicist flashed on the screen. She hesitated before answering, a tightness forming in her throat that she could not quite explain. The voice on the other end was frantic, layered with the brittle tone of someone trying to stay professional while panicking. The video from the diner had gone viral overnight. Millions had seen it. Victoria's sharp words, Emily's calm reply, the stunned silence that followed. Every detail captured in shaky clarity from a stranger's phone, It had been posted with a caption that spread like wildfire, painting her as the embodiment of arrogance. The internet had no mercy. Within hours, hashtags bearing her name filled social feeds, and comments flooded with outrage and disbelief. Her company's social accounts were bombarded, and by dawn, several of her brand partners had issued statements about respect and corporate values. Victoria listened without speaking, the sound of her own heartbeat roaring louder than her publicist's voice. The words reputation, crisis, damage control, apology floated through the air like smoke. She felt lightheaded. The walls of her immaculate apartment suddenly seemed to close in. She walked toward the window, phone pressed loosely to her ear, and stared out at the skyline that had once represented triumph. Now it looked indifferent, vast and unreachable. She ended the call without saying goodbye. The city below carried on as if nothing had happened, yet somewhere inside its endless movement her name had become a symbol of cruelty. Her reflection in the window stared back at her again, this time not blurred by rain but sharpened by morning light. She saw a woman who had spent decades mastering control, undone by a single moment of truth spoken softly in a diner. The thought stung her pride but pierced something deeper too. She picked up the remote and turned on the television. Every news channel carried the story. Commentators debated her character, journalists replayed the clip, and social feeds displayed side-by-side images of her glamorous public appearances next to screenshots of her anger. Her face filled the screen, but her eyes looked foreign, almost desperate. She muted the sound and sat in silence, watching herself become a caricature of everything she had tried to hide. Her empire had always been built on image, on perception, on the illusion of flawless composure. Now that image was cracking. The morning light reached across the room, pale and unforgiving, exposing every reflection and every truth she could no longer ignore. The humiliation was public, but the awakening was private. For the first time, Victoria Lang realized that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one quietly forming within her. Victoria Lang arrived at her company headquarters that afternoon beneath a sky of slate-grey clouds, her black car pulling up to the private entrance she had used for years to avoid the press. Cameras still waited at the main doors, their flashes bursting like lightning as reporters shouted her name. But she did not turn her head. Inside, the building smelled faintly of polished glass and money. A world she had once ruled with absolute certainty. Now, as she walked through the gleaming lobby, she felt the unfamiliar sting of eyes on her. Employees lowered their voices as she passed, their greetings softer than usual, their smiles forced. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, each step a performance of confidence she did not feel. She entered her office, a cathedral of modern luxury with floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist perfection, and closed the door harder than necessary. The sound echoed like a shot. Her assistant, a young woman named Claire, followed hesitantly, holding a stack of reports and the day's news summaries. Her hands trembled as she spoke, explaining the fallout, the clients reconsidering partnerships, the investors demanding statements. Victoria snatched the papers from her and began reading, her jaw tight, her eyes narrowing at every mention of her name. Her voice rose as she fired questions faster than Claire could answer, demanding why no one had anticipated this, why the company's response had been so weak, why she was being treated like a villain when the situation was just a misunderstanding. Her anger filled the room like smoke, suffocating and heavy. Claire's voice cracked as she tried to respond, and in that moment Victoria saw it. The same flicker of fear she had seen countless times before, the same look that Emily had refused to show. The realization hit her harder than any headline. She stopped mid-sentence, her own breath faltering. For the first time, she noticed how pale the young woman looked, how small she seemed beneath the weight of her rage. The silence stretched as Claire lowered her eyes, mumbling an apology for something that wasn't her fault. Victoria turned away, unable to meet her gaze. She dismissed her with a quiet word, and the assistant fled, closing the door softly behind her. The echo lingered. Alone now, Victoria sank into her chair, her reflection caught in the glass wall behind her desk. The city loomed beyond, vast and relentless, and for the first time it looked cold. Her hands were still shaking. She stared at the papers on her desk, the meaningless graphs and numbers, the performance metrics that had once defined her success. They looked hollow now, stripped of importance. She leaned back and closed her eyes, the image of Emily's calm face flashing again in her mind. The same fear she inspired in others had once been her measure of control, but now it looked like proof of her failure. For years she had believed respect could be bought, loyalty could be managed, and truth could be silenced. Now, in the sterile perfection of her own office, she finally saw the emptiness she had mistaken for power. Across town, the rain had slowed to a mist that clung to the cracked sidewalks as Emily Carter walked home from her early shift. The city looked softer under the pale light, the noise dimmed by the wet air. Her phone buzzed constantly in her pocket, but she ignored it. The viral storm she had accidentally created was spinning faster than she could comprehend. Messages from strangers, journalists, and distant relatives flooded her notifications, some praising her courage, others mocking her, all demanding a piece of her story. But Emily had no interest in fame or explanations. She stopped at a small bakery, bought 2 muffins, and continued to the old brick apartment she shared with her mother's caregiver. The building smelled faintly of rain and laundry detergent. Inside, her mother's voice greeted her softly from the living room. The older woman's health had been fragile for years, her body weakened by illness but her spirit unbroken. Emily smiled and placed the muffins on the table before helping her mother sit up. She asked about her day, listening as though nothing outside those walls existed. The air inside the apartment was warm, filled with the faint hum of a television tuned to low volume. The contrast between this quiet haven and the chaos outside could not have been greater. Emily's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from the diner manager. He told her to take a few days off while things cooled down. The wording was kind, but she could read the fear behind it. She knew the owners would not risk losing wealthy customers because of a waitress who spoke out. Yet she felt no anger, only a tired sort of acceptance. She had spent her life being careful, polite, invisible when necessary, and now that the world had noticed her, it did not feel like victory. It felt like exposure. She brought her mother her tea, the cup trembling slightly in her hand, and sat beside her. Her mother asked gently if she was all right. Emily nodded, saying she was fine, that things would pass soon. She did not mention the video or the comments or the articles. Instead, she asked if her mother remembered the story about the stray cat they used to feed behind the old house when she was a child. Her mother smiled and nodded, and for a moment, the tension in Emily's chest eased. Outside, sirens wailed faintly in the distance, blending with the sound of the rain returning in thin streaks against the window. The world was watching her, but in that small room, time felt mercifully still. She looked at her mother's tired hands resting on the blanket and felt the same resolve that had carried her through the confrontation. She had not spoken to humiliate anyone. She had spoken because silence had become too heavy to carry. In her mother's quiet presence, Emily remembered who she was, and that was enough. At the nursing home the following afternoon, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender, a fragile blend of care and decay that clung to the hallways. Emily Carter walked slowly beside her mother's wheelchair, pushing gently as sunlight filtered through lace curtains and painted the linoleum floor in broken gold. The residents moved through the corridors like ghosts of gentler times, nodding politely as she passed. Emily greeted each one by name, her voice soft but steady, carrying warmth that felt genuine in a place where time moved differently. Her mother smiled faintly, her thin fingers wrapped around a small blanket Emily had knitted during nights when worry kept her awake. They stopped near the window where pigeons gathered on the sill, and for a while they simply watched them flutter in the rain. Emily asked if her mother was comfortable, adjusting her shawl when she nodded. The outside world still buzzed with noise, with articles and interviews, with people dissecting her every expression. But here, none of that mattered. The room smelled faintly of roses from a vase on the nightstand, a cheap bouquet that somehow filled the space with tenderness. Emily sat down, her posture relaxing for the first time all day. Her mother spoke softly, asking if she had found peace after what had happened. Emily hesitated, then said that peace felt like something she had to build rather than find. Her mother nodded knowingly, her eyes clouded yet sharp with memory. She told Emily that strength is not always in the fight, but in the grace to walk away without bitterness. The words sank into Emily's chest like a seed taking root. She thought about all the nights her mother had worked double shifts as a nurse, her hands raw, her back aching, never once losing her gentleness. That was where she had learned patience, where she had learned to meet cruelty without becoming cruel. The sound of a clock ticking filled the small room, marking each second with calm precision. Emily reached for her mother's hand and held it quietly, the simple contact grounding her more than any praise from strangers ever could. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled by, and somewhere down the hall a nurse laughed softly at a patient's joke. Life went on, unbothered by headlines or outrage. Emily realized she preferred this rhythm, the rhythm of care, of small kindnesses that never made the news. Her mother closed her eyes to rest, and Emily sat beside her, lost in thought. She remembered her father's laughter, his endless tinkering with broken things, and how he used to say that fixing something was a form of love. She had spent her life trying to fix what cruelty broke, even when it left scars. The peace in that small room reminded her that her worth had never depended on how loudly the world applauded, but on how quietly she endured. That evening, beneath the glittering chandeliers of the Metropolitan Grand Hotel, Victoria Lang walked into the charity gala meant to restore her image. The marble floors gleamed like ice under the lights, and the air smelled of perfume and polished silver. Every step she took was calculated, every movement rehearsed. Cameras flashed, and reporters murmured as she entered wearing an emerald gown that shimmered with the same precision as her practiced smile. On the surface, she looked immaculate, untouchable, but inside she was unraveling. The murmur of polite conversation filled the vast ballroom, a mixture of laughter, champagne glasses clinking, and the hollow rhythm of forced civility. She had attended hundreds of these events, all of them blurring together into the same predictable dance of wealth and vanity. Tonight, the sound grated against her nerves. The familiar faces that turned toward her now did so with polite curiosity instead of admiration. She could feel it in their eyes. They had all seen the video. They all knew. A senator's wife leaned in to whisper something to her husband as Victoria passed, and the small smile on their faces felt sharp as a blade. She moved toward the bar, pretending not to notice. The bartender asked what she would like, but she waved him off and reached for a flute of champagne instead. The bubbles rose in perfect spirals, mocking her attempts to stay composed. Her business partner approached, his words dipped in sympathy, but his eyes cold with calculation. He told her the press cycle would pass, that time would dull the outrage, that she needed only to stay quiet and let the noise fade. She nodded absently, but his advice sounded hollow. The room, once her stage, now felt like a prison gilded with chandeliers. The laughter around her seemed artificial, the praise rehearsed, the smiles empty. She glanced toward the grand staircase where photographers waited for new arrivals, and for the first time she saw through the illusion. Every face around her carried the same hunger, the same fear of being seen as less. She suddenly understood that she had been one of them, driven not by confidence but by terror of irrelevance. The weight of that realization pressed against her chest, stealing her breath. She excused herself and stepped out onto the balcony, the night air sharp and cool against her skin. The city lights spread below her, beautiful yet indifferent, the same city where a young waitress had stood unshaken in front of her. The wind tugged at her hair, carrying the faint echo of laughter from inside. She took a slow sip of champagne and set the glass down, her hands trembling slightly. For years, she had believed that power came from commanding attention, from standing above. Now she stood alone under the glittering skyline, realizing that power had never looked lonelier. Later that night, long after the gala's noise had faded and the city had sunk into a restless quiet, Victoria Lang sat in her study, surrounded by shadows and the soft hum of distant traffic. The clock on the mantel ticked evenly, each sound a reminder that time kept moving whether she deserved it or not. Sleep refused to come. The image of Emily Carter standing in that diner, calm and unbroken, haunted her like a melody she could not forget. Her phone lay face down on the desk, the glow of notifications still bleeding faintly through the screen. With a hesitant breath, she turned it over and opened her browser. Her fingers moved without thought as she typed the name Emily Carter into the search bar. The results appeared instantly. Headlines, articles, short clips, even fan accounts. Everyone had an opinion about the young waitress who had stood up to a billionaire. Some called her brave, some called her foolish. But every story carried the same image of quiet dignity that Victoria could not escape. She scrolled farther until she found an interview from a local news station. The thumbnail showed Emily sitting on a park bench, her uniform gone, her hair loose, her posture humble but firm. Victoria clicked it. The video played in muted light. Emily spoke slowly, her tone even and clear. She said she did not hate Victoria Lang. She said she felt sorry for her. She explained that sometimes people with too much power forget what it means to be human, that cruelty becomes habit when no one tells you the truth. The words hit Victoria harder than any insult could have. She paused the video and stared at Emily's face, frozen mid-sentence. The pity in those eyes was unbearable. She leaned back in her chair, her hand covering her mouth as her chest tightened. No one had ever spoken of her that way. People had feared her, envied her, obeyed her, but no one had pitied her. It was the kind of judgment that stripped away the illusion of control. She rose from her chair and began pacing the room, the soft carpet swallowing the sound of her steps. The city stretched outside her window, glittering like a field of broken glass. Somewhere down there, Emily Carter was living a life that seemed smaller, but felt suddenly more complete. Victoria stopped and looked at her reflection in the glass again, searching for traces of the person she once admired. All she saw was exhaustion. The lines around her mouth looked deeper, the brightness in her eyes dimmed. The pity made sense now. She had built her empire on conquest and validation, but in the process she had emptied herself. The realization burned in her throat. For the first time in decades, she whispered a truth she had never allowed herself to say aloud. She was tired of being powerful. The following morning, sunlight broke through the haze for the first time in days, but it offered no warmth to Victoria Lang as she sat at her kitchen table staring at the untouched breakfast before her. The gleam of polished marble and stainless steel felt obscene in the brightness. Her phone rang endlessly, vibrating across the surface like a trapped insect. She let it ring until the sound stopped, only for it to start again seconds later. At last, she answered. It was her head of communications, speaking in clipped tones about sponsors withdrawing support, investors threatening to sell shares, and media outlets publishing op-eds about corporate ethics. Her empire, built on decades of image and influence, was beginning to crumble beneath the weight of a single truth. Victoria listened in silence, each word falling like a stone into the hollow of her chest. When the call ended, she opened her laptop and stared at the company's website. The logo she had once found so reassuring now looked sterile, its sharp letters spelling out an identity she no longer recognized. Her reflection in the screen seemed older, lonelier, stripped of the arrogance that once masked her fear. She opened a blank document, her fingers hovering over the keys. Then she began to type. The words came slowly at first, cautious and unsure, but soon they gathered momentum, spilling out in sentences she had never imagined herself writing. She admitted fault, she confessed arrogance. She apologized to Emily Carter by name. She acknowledged that her behavior in the diner was cruel and uncalled for. She wrote that power without humility corrodes the soul, and that she had forgotten the difference between leadership and control. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking. She reread the statement twice, expecting to feel relief, but what she felt instead was fear. For years she had dictated every message her company released, carefully curating every phrase. This was different. This was not crafted. It was raw. She clicked send before she could change her mind. The message went to her communications team for release. Minutes later, her phone began lighting up again, flooded with alerts. News outlets were already reporting her public apology, calling it both unexpected and overdue. Some praised her honesty, others dismissed it as strategy, but she didn't care. She shut the laptop and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The truth was out there now, detached from her control, living its own life in the world. It was a strange kind of freedom, frightening yet clean. Still, she knew it was not enough. Words alone could not erase the years of fear she had inspired. nor could they heal the quiet wound she had left in a stranger's heart. The apology was only the beginning, a crack in the shell she had spent a lifetime building, and through it, light was finally starting to enter. That evening, as twilight bled softly into the city skyline, Victoria Lang stepped out of a black car parked across the street from the small diner where her downfall had begun. She wore no designer coat, no statement jewelry, just a simple grey sweater and jeans that felt unfamiliar against her skin. The neon sign above the window flickered, the same imperfect rhythm she remembered, casting faint red light onto the wet pavement. Inside, the diner buzzed with quiet conversation, the scent of coffee and fried onions mingling in the air. Victoria hesitated before entering, her heart pounding with an unease she could not disguise. For years she had walked into rooms certain of her power, but now she felt like a trespasser in a world she had never truly seen. The bell above the door chimed as she stepped inside, and a few patrons turned to look. Recognition rippled across the room, whispered but unspoken. The manager froze mid-step behind the counter, unsure whether to greet her or hide. Victoria offered a small nod, her voice low and unsteady as she asked if Emily was working tonight. The manager pointed toward the back booth, where a young woman sat alone, her uniform replaced by a worn cardigan, her hair pulled loosely behind her head. She was reading a small notebook, its pages yellowed and creased, a faint smile on her lips. Victoria approached slowly, her steps careful, as though afraid the air itself might shatter. Emily looked up, surprise flickering in her eyes before settling into calm composure. The silence between them felt heavier than words. Victoria stood for a moment before speaking. She said that she had come not to justify, not to perform, but to say something she should have said long ago. Her voice trembled slightly, the smoothness gone. She admitted she had been cruel, not just to Emily but to countless others who had lived in the shadow of her pride. Emily listened quietly, her gaze steady but unreadable. The sounds of plates clinking and coffee pouring filled the background like distant waves. Victoria continued, saying that she had spent the last week trying to understand why those few calm words in the diner had shaken her so deeply, and that she realized now it was because they were true. Her confession hung in the air between them, unadorned and unprotected. The waitress who had once stood small before her now seemed unshakable, anchored by the kind of strength that did not need to be seen to be known. The tension in Victoria's shoulders softened as she waited for judgment. Emily said nothing for a long while, then gestured for her to sit. Her eyes were still, her breathing even, her presence quiet yet immense. Around them, the diner carried on, but it felt as if the whole world had narrowed to that one booth. The billionaire who had once ruled boardrooms now sat across from a woman whose only weapon had been truth. Emily studied Victoria for several seconds that stretched into what felt like minutes, her eyes neither forgiving nor condemning, only searching. The diner's soft lighting brushed against the edges of their faces, catching the faint steam that curled upward from a forgotten cup of coffee between them. Victoria's hands rested on the table, fingers laced tightly together, her knuckles pale. She looked smaller than she ever had, her confidence peeled back to something raw and human. She began to speak again, her words quiet, halting but sincere. She said she had spent her whole life confusing power with respect, mistaking fear for loyalty, and she had believed that dominance made her strong. She told Emily that after hearing her words that day, she had not been able to sleep. had not been able to look at herself without seeing what she had become. She admitted she had thought success could erase the things she had done to others, but that it never truly could. Emily listened, her face unreadable, the way someone listens to rain after a storm, letting the sound wash over her without needing to respond. When Victoria's voice finally broke, she stopped speaking and looked down at her clasped hands. The silence that followed was not heavy with judgment, but filled with a quiet, living stillness. Emily took a slow breath, her tone gentle when she finally spoke. She said that she had not wanted revenge. She said that what had happened that night was not planned, that her words had simply come from exhaustion and truth. She explained that she had seen in Victoria's anger something she recognized, the kind of loneliness that builds when you start to believe no one can challenge you anymore. Victoria's eyes lifted, wet with the tears she had refused to show the world. Emily's calmness held them both steady, anchoring the fragile peace forming between them. The sounds of the diner moved around them softly, forks scraping against plates, a radio playing faintly from the kitchen, the hum of ordinary life continuing as if to remind them that the world would keep spinning regardless of apology or fame. For the first time, Victoria did not care about being seen or understood. She only cared about being real. She whispered that she did not expect forgiveness, only the chance to do better. Emily's expression softened, and she nodded once, not as acceptance, but as acknowledgement. Her gaze held no triumph, only quiet empathy. For the first time, they sat as equals, two women divided by circumstance but united by truth. When Victoria stood to leave, she felt the faintest sense of peace touch her chest. Emily watched her go, her hand resting lightly on the notebook before her, knowing that some moments change everything without needing to be loud. Emily sat for a long moment after Victoria left, her hand still resting on the worn notebook that had lain open between them. The pages smelled faintly of age and coffee, the ink faded but familiar. She turned to a section near the back where her father's handwriting slanted unevenly across the paper. Each line carried the gentle precision of a man who had spent his life building things with care. He had once been a chef, proud but humble, a man who believed in the artistry of small gestures. She could still see him in their old kitchen, humming softly as he stirred sauces, telling her that every act of creation, no matter how small, was a form of love. But she also remembered the day everything changed. He had lost his job after standing up to the wealthy owner of a restaurant, a woman who had mocked him for being too idealistic, for caring too much about fairness. The shame of it had dimmed his spark, though he had never spoken about it aloud. Emily had been only 12 then, watching as her father's pride turned into silence. He spent his last years teaching her that dignity had nothing to do with status and everything to do with integrity. The notebook was his legacy, filled with recipes, sketches, and fragments of thoughts about life and kindness. One passage in particular echoed through her mind now as she traced the words with her finger. It said that cruelty often disguises itself as strength, and that true courage is found in those who remain gentle despite the world's roughness. Emily closed the book, her chest tightening with memory and resolve. She had carried that notebook with her for years, first as a talisman, then as a reminder that no matter how hard things became, her worth could not be taken from her. The confrontation with Victoria had awakened that lesson again, not in anger, but in understanding. She realized now that the diner moment had not been an accident. It had been a continuation of her father's story, a generational echo of standing up against power without losing grace. The hum of the diner around her grounded her in the present, the sound of plates clinking and conversation folding into soft laughter. She looked out the window, watching headlights sweep across puddles as the city carried on, unaware of the quiet reckoning that had taken place inside. She felt both small and infinite, her grief mingling with a strange peace. The notebook lay closed before her, its cover worn smooth from years of being held. It no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a torch passed forward. Her father's words had lived through her, and through them, she had found her own voice. Victoria sat in her car outside the diner for several minutes before asking her driver to wait. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and shining under the glow of streetlights. The city hummed softly around her, unaware that her entire world had shifted. When she finally returned to her penthouse, she moved through the vast space in silence, her footsteps echoing faintly against the marble floors. The apology had not given her closure, but it had opened something she had long buried beneath pride. Sleep refused to come. She stood by the window, staring at the skyline she had once believed she owned, the towers gleaming like a monument to everything she had mistaken for meaning. The next morning, she summoned her executive team to the conference room. They gathered nervously, expecting another round of anger or control, but her demeanor was different. The hardness in her eyes had been replaced by something quiet, something that looked almost like humility. She told them she wanted to change the company's direction. Her voice was low, steady, stripped of its usual authority. She spoke about rebuilding from within, about creating a culture of respect rather than fear. Her employees exchanged uncertain glances, thinking it was another performance for the press, but as she continued, they heard sincerity in her tone that could not be rehearsed. She admitted that she had failed them, that she had built an empire that rewarded obedience instead of integrity. There was a long silence after she finished speaking. No one moved at first. Then one young designer spoke up, saying that if she meant what she said, they would help her rebuild. The words struck her harder than applause ever had. Later that afternoon, she called a private meeting with her financial advisors. They expected her to discuss recovery strategies, but instead, she asked for ways to invest in something that could matter. Her advisor began suggesting charitable foundations and image repair campaigns, but she interrupted him. She told him she did not want publicity. She wanted purpose. The words surprised even her as they left her mouth. That night, she drafted a handwritten letter to Emily. It was not an apology, for she had already given that, but a promise. She wrote that she would take what she had and use it for something better, that she had no right to ask for forgiveness, but she would earn it through action. She ended the letter by quoting something Emily had said in the diner, that real change begins when no one is watching. When she sealed the envelope, she felt a strange calm settle over her. She did not know if Emily would ever read it. What mattered was that she meant it. In that quiet moment, Victoria Lang realized that redemption was not a destination, but a daily decision, one she was finally ready to make. Months later, spring unfolded across the city with a brightness that felt almost cleansing, sunlight spilling through the tall windows of a renovated conference hall bearing a new name etched in glass. The Lang Foundation for Dignity and Work had just been launched, but Victoria Lang had insisted her name appear smaller than the rest of the inscription. The event drew business leaders, journalists, and workers from every background. though the tone was nothing like her past galas. There were no chandeliers or champagne towers, only simple white lights and rows of folding chairs arranged in quiet order. At the front of the room, a large poster displayed the Foundation's first initiative, a scholarship and training program for hospitality workers designed to provide education, healthcare, and fair wages. Victoria moved through the crowd with a calmness that surprised even herself. The whispers that had once followed her carried a different sound now, less judgment and more curiosity. She greeted each guest with unforced sincerity, her eyes no longer scanning the room for approval, but meeting people's faces as if seeing them for the first time. Emily Carter arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, wearing a modest navy dress. She had hesitated to attend, unsure whether this event would feel like another performance of remorse, but when she saw the room's simplicity, she sensed it was genuine. Victoria approached her near the entrance, her smile subdued but real. She thanked Emily for coming, her voice soft, uncertain, but steady. Emily nodded, saying she had only come to see if the words Victoria had spoken months before had become action. Victoria gestured toward the stage, inviting her to see for herself. When the program began, Victoria stood before the crowd, her speech brief and unpolished. She said that power had blinded her for too long, that she had once believed influence could replace humanity, but that she had learned otherwise from someone whose courage had forced her to see truth. She did not use Emily's name, but everyone understood. She announced that the foundation would be run by a diverse board, most of them former service workers, and that transparency would be its core principle. When she stepped back, the applause that followed was not thunderous but warm, the kind that rises from sincerity rather than spectacle. Emily watched from her seat, her hands clasped loosely in her lap. For the first time, she saw in Victoria something unrecognizable yet redeeming, a quiet humility that could not be faked. After the event, Victoria approached her once more, asking if she would consider serving as an advisor to the foundation. Emily hesitated before agreeing, not as an act of forgiveness, but as a commitment to purpose. The moment held no drama, no tears, only understanding. The two women shook hands, not as enemies reconciled, but as equals bound by shared resolve to turn pain into change. 3 years later, the city woke to headlines celebrating the rise of Reed and Lang Industries, a company born from the ashes of guilt and rebuilt on the foundation of purpose. Their flagship project, a sustainable hospitality network powered by renewable energy and fair labor, had transformed entire districts, turning abandoned spaces into community-driven centers of learning and opportunity. Victoria Lang no longer occupied penthouse boardrooms or glossy magazine covers. Instead, she worked from a modest corner office overlooking the river, her desk cluttered with handwritten notes and design sketches. She had become quieter, slower, more deliberate in her choices, her wealth no longer a shield but a tool she wielded with care. Across the city, Emily Carter stood before a crowd at the opening of the newest training center, her voice strong yet grounded as she spoke about dignity, kindness, and the courage to confront injustice with grace. Her words carried the same calm strength that had silenced a diner years ago, now echoing across an audience that listened with genuine admiration. Victoria watched from the back of the room, unnoticed by most, her presence steady but humble. When Emily finished her speech, the crowd erupted in applause, not for spectacle, but for the truth behind her story. Victoria felt tears well at the edges of her vision, not from sorrow, but from a quiet kind of peace. The applause washed over her like redemption she had never sought but somehow earned. After the ceremony, Emily found her near the doorway, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. No words were needed. The distance between them had long ago been bridged not by forgiveness, but by purpose. Outside, the sky stretched wide and clean, sunlight glinting off the river as if the city itself were exhaling. Victoria turned to leave, her steps slow, unhurried. As she passed a wall covered with framed photographs of scholarship recipients and new business owners whose lives had changed because two women had chosen truth over pride. Her reflection caught faintly in the glass beside theirs, no longer commanding, no longer cold, just human. She smiled, the expression small but real. The world no longer whispered her name in scandal, but spoke it in gratitude, not for what she had built alone, but for what she had helped others build in return. Emily stood by the window watching her go, a soft smile on her face. She thought of the diner, of the quiet courage it had taken to speak that single sentence, and how it had rippled outward into something far greater than vengeance. What began as confrontation had become legacy. The billionaire who once believed herself untouchable had learned that true power lives not in wealth, but in the humility to change. If this story moved you or made you see the world a little differently, take a moment to give this video a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us create more stories that remind us of what really matters. Make sure to subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss the next powerful journey of truth, courage, and redemption. And share this story with someone who needs to remember that kindness is never weakness, that even the smallest act of honesty can change the course of a life, and that sometimes the most ordinary moment can become the spark that rewrites everything. Thank you for watching, and for believing that change always begins with compassion.